Yesterday's prophecies, today's headlines. This is the Hal Lindsey Report. And now, Hal Lindsey.
Good evening and welcome to this edition of the Hal Lindsey Report. In the Las Vegas Guardian Express, Rebecca Savastillo writes that a new study shows religion will completely disappear by 2041. A startling statement, but not very credible. Like so many journalists trying to grasp academic studies, she misunderstood. Nigel Barber, the study's author, wrote an article for the Huffington Post clarifying his findings. I project that religious people will be a minority by that date, which is a very different prediction. Very different indeed, but just as unlikely. Sequestered in an ivory tower, looking at church attendance figures, he's failing to see the bigger picture. Everyone is religious. The brilliant scientist, philosopher, and mathematician Blaise Pascal said, "There's a God-shaped vacuum in the heart of every man, which cannot be filled by any created thing, but only by God the Creator, made known through Jesus." This is why people are religious by nature, and why man-made religions don't satisfy or bring peace. Only one person can do that, Jesus Christ. But Mr. Barber is not going out on a limb if he is talking about the decline of organized religion. Already most of those who claim an affiliation with one of the major world religions do so as a matter of family tradition, not personal faith. Will religion be supplanted by atheism in just 28 years? In Luke 18, verse 8, Jesus asked a far more pertinent question. When the Son of Man comes, will he find faith on the earth? I'm really not too concerned about the growth of atheism. Sometimes it's easier for an atheist to be saved than someone who identifies with a standard religion, because religion often blinds people to the truth. But I am concerned about the church. According to 1 Timothy chapter 4, in the latter times some will depart from the faith, giving heed to deceiving spirits and doctrines of demons. I believe that Jesus is coming soon. So let's look around and ask ourselves, when Jesus returns, will he find faith? What will he find? Instead of looking at the whole world, let's look first at the United States of America. If the Obama administration has its way, Jesus will not find faith when he looks into the United States military. I've been telling you about the Pentagon's war on soldiers who are Christian. Not long ago, that war took an especially bizarre turn. An Air Force chaplain, Lieutenant Colonel Kenneth Reyes, wrote this regular column for the base website. He titled his essay, "No Atheists in Foxholes. Chaplains Gave All in World War II." Now, whether or not you agree with the idea that there are no atheists in foxholes, it has been a largely accepted truism in military circles for a long time. It seems to have come out of World War II, but historians disagree on who said it first. It fully entered the American consciousness, though, in a broadcast of the American Legion's Back to God program in 1954. In the 1950s, the American Legion hosted a series of nationally broadcasted network television shows called Back to God, a part of the Legion's Go to Church Sunday initiative. Can you see that happening today? That alone says volumes about America's decline. In 1954, President Dwight Eisenhower addressed the program from the White House, saying, "As a former soldier, I am delighted that our veterans are sponsoring a movement to increase our awareness of God in our daily lives. In battle, they learn a great truth, that there are no atheists in the foxholes." Eisenhower is one of only 5 Americans to reach the rank of 5-star general. In World War II, he served as Supreme Commander of Allied forces in Europe. Of U.S. military leaders, only George Washington is as universally revered as Dwight Eisenhower. Quoting him would seem like safe ground, but not in the anti-Christian environment of today's military. Mikey Weinstein and his Military Religious Freedom Foundation were outraged by this innocuous statement. They called it bigoted and religious supremacist. Calling something religious supremacist is intended to create anger, but not thought. It's supposed to bring to mind the phrase white supremacist. But other than the phraseology, there's no connection between the two. No one can change his race. If you think you're superior to your fellow human beings because of the color of your skin, then you're prejudiced. Acts chapter 17, verse 26 says that God made from one blood every nation of men. But if you think you or your group's ideas on God are superior to others, then welcome to the human race. Virtually everyone thinks his ideas on religion are superior. Both the Presbyterian and the atheist think his understanding of God is better than the others. If anyone's a religious supremacist, then everyone is. Someone might say, not me. I think all religions are equal. And if you think you are right in that, and I am wrong in my opinion, then according to Mikey Weinstein, you are a religious supremacist. Weinstein's idea here was not meant for close examination. It's simply a hateful, shoot-from-the-hip liberal slur. He thinks that you throw a lot of them in the air, throw them often enough, and you hope some of them will stick. It's not the work of a fair person, but the unthought-out slurs of a propagandist. They also called the phrase, no atheists in foxholes, bigotry. Really? You think that's bigoted? It's an opinion, one held by millions of servicemen over many years. Of course, it's not true in every single case, but enough atheists have been heard to cry out to God under those extreme circumstances to give the old statement the ring of truth. The feeling is captured in Billy Joel's song, Good Night Saigon. We dug in deep and shot on sight and prayed to Jesus Christ with all our might. If you disagree, that's your privilege. Say it's wrong. Let's have a discussion. But to call it bigotry, you must have another agenda. Mikey and his friends are not trying to correct an error. They're calling for the mob to light their torches, grab their pitchforks, and start burning anything that looks like a cross. Ordinarily, a single group making a big deal of a military chaplain quoting the comments of one of our all-time greatest generals wouldn't be worth mentioning. But this case is different. Why? Well, you see, Weinstein is the Obama administration's go-to guy on the issue of religious freedom in the military. No wonder. And that makes it very important. For those who think he has no influence, look at this. Only 5 hours after the complaint, someone removed the article from the website. Base Commander Colonel Brian Duffy actually apologized for not stopping his chaplain from sharing religious thoughts. But the commander's apology wasn't enough for Mikey. The MRFF said, faith-based hate is hate all the same. Lieutenant Colonel Reyes must be appropriately punished. Hate? Honoring the chaplains of World War II by quoting a famous phrase from that war is supposed to be hate? Well, I shouldn't be surprised. After all, Weinstein is the man who calls a soldier sharing his faith spiritual rape. He calls Christians monsters, terrorists, and enemies of the Constitution. Mikey Weinstein believes that evangelical Christians create a hostile environment for atheists in the armed forces. What planet does he come from? I served in the Coast Guard during the Korean War. I know for a fact that servicemen are not famous for their squeaky clean language, for never boozing it up or engaging prostitutes, or for acting like a congregation of saints whenever they're on shore leave. Weinstein wants you to think that the guys who want to carouse are made to feel just terrible by the existence of Christians in their branch of the service. After all, who ever heard of soldiers, sailors, or Marines ribbing, harassing, or demeaning a guy for not participating in the usual debauchery, or for reading the Bible or expressing his faith? Christians aren't complaining about these things. That's just the way it is. But to claim that they are the ones creating hostile environment for the more worldly soldiers is beyond stupid. Ken Blackwell, former U.S. ambassador to the United Nations Human Rights Commission, told Breitbart News, President Obama is waging a war on religion. He and Chuck Hagel are denying the most basic rights to those who put their lives on the line to protect all of our rights. It is shameful and appalling. I want to remind you how it used to be after this brief message. In his book, The Spiritual Industrial Complex, America's Religious Battle Against Communism in the Early Cold War, Jonathan Hertzog wrote, U.S. Army instructors in the 1950s told new recruits that the world was divided into three kinds of nations. There were demonic nations that attacked both organized religion and belief in higher powers. There were secular nations that enforced a strict separation between church and state. And then there were covenant nations that recognized their dependence upon God. It would be reasonable to assume that the U.S. Army considered America secular, but Americans and their leaders in the early Cold War knew differently. The United States was a covenant nation. Now, whether you agree or not, it's important to understand that this was the attitude in our armed services just 60 years ago. G.K. Chesterton said, America is the only nation in the world that is founded on a creed. The Declaration of Independence does in fact read like a creed with God at the very center. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights. Some have tried to equate America with Israel. I'm not doing that. It'd be wrong. The United States is a covenant nation only because God made certain covenants with all nations. For instance, in Genesis chapter 12, verse 3, God promises to bless those who bless Abraham. It goes the other way too. Psalm 107, verse 34 tells us that he changes a fruitful land into a salt waste because of the wickedness of those who dwell in it. Proverbs 14:34 says, righteousness exalts a nation, but sin is a disgrace to any people. James chapter 4, verse 8, draw near to God, and he will draw near to you. It is written primarily to individuals, but there is a corporate application as well. And despite her frequent failings, America has drawn close to God, as have few nations in history. She has gone to war, but again and again, it was not for lands or wealth, but to release the oppressed, to set captives free. And it did these things in part as an outgrowth of a corporate reverence for Almighty God, His Word, and His principles. That is the heart of American exceptionalism. And the reason those 1950s Army instructors could teach new recruits that our nation is a covenant nation. Winston Churchill understood this on a profound level. In August of 1941, 4 months before the attack on Pearl Harbor, Prime Minister Churchill and President Franklin Roosevelt met off the coast of Newfoundland. They were there ostensibly to hammer out what would later be called the Atlantic Charter, which was a set of goals for the post-war world. But for Churchill, there was another more pressing matter: the survival of the British Empire. It was a dark time in the world, and at that moment, the German army was sweeping across the Soviet Union. Britain was in a precarious state, dependent on U.S. arms for its very survival, and desperately needing the United States to actively enter the war. The conference began on a Saturday aboard the American ship, the USS Augusta. On Sunday, they held a church service aboard the British ship, the Prince of Wales. Churchill would later describe it in a radio broadcast.
We had a church parade on the Sunday in our Atlantic Bay. The President came onto the quarterdeck of the Prince of Wales, where there were mingled together many hundreds of American and British sailors and Marines. The sun shone bright and warm, while we all sang the old hymns which are our common inheritance and which we learned as children in our homes. We sang, "Onward, Christian soldiers." And indeed I felt that this was no vain presumption, but that we had the right to feel that we were serving a cause for the sake of which a trumpet had sounded from on high. When I looked upon that densely packed congregation of fighting men of the same language, of the same faith, of the same fundamental laws, of the same ideals, and now to a large extent of the same interests, and certainly in different degrees facing the same dangers, it swept across me that here was the only hope, but also the sure hope of saving the world from measureless degradation.
Neither Roosevelt nor Churchill were particularly pious men. Churchill had said that instead of a pillar of the Church of England, he was a flying buttress supporting it from the outside. But according to eyewitnesses, as they sang "Onward, Christian Soldiers," the battle-hardened Prime Minister wept. In response to the song, Roosevelt said, "We are Christian soldiers, and we will go on with God's help." Later, the president told his son that singing the old hymn cemented us. Years later, Churchill would write of their hymn singing, "Every word seemed to stir the heart. It was a great hour to live." It's sad to consider that in Britain today, less than 10% of the population attends any kind of religious service, even monthly, and that a high percentage of those who do attend are Muslims, not Christians. 2 Thessalonians chapter 2, verse 3 predicts a coming apostasy or falling away in the last days. A Pew study shows a surprising growth of atheism among young Americans. This tends to confirm Nigel Barber's study predicting religion's minority status by 2041. His book, Why Atheism Will Replace Religion, uses a simple thesis: atheism blossoms amid affluence. Remarkably, the Bible teaches something similar. Deuteronomy chapter 8 says to remember God by keeping His commandments. Otherwise, when you have eaten and are satisfied and have built good houses and lived in them, and when your herds and your flocks multiply, and your silver and gold multiply, and all that you have multiplies, then your heart will become proud and you will forget the Lord your God. In other words, beyond the foxhole, we forget what it was like in there. With prosperity, we forget our vulnerability. With wealth comes the illusion of self-sufficiency. We forget the God who brought us out of Egypt the God who gave us the very prosperity that then leads us to forget Him. Have you ever wondered why He doesn't grant us our every whim? This is why. Life's struggles remind us of our need to depend upon the Lord. He blesses us in a multitude of ways, but His goal is to make us better, not make our lives easy. Despite growing opposition from media and academia, evangelicalism has continued to grow since the 1950s. But polls show mounting disdain for the church, especially among the young. This has many wringing their hands in fear. Where will Christianity be in 2041? An influential pastor of a popular megachurch explains that Christians have a branding problem. He says we're seen as judgmental and homophobic. The popular sentiment seems to be that if we would simply love and affirm people, the reputation of the church would be restored and we would win many to Christ. Not only is this unbiblical, it's extremely simple-minded. If you go to your doctor about a health issue, you hope he will say, "All's well." But even though you want to hear something positive, you need to hear the truth, even if it's a hard truth. On the surface, "all's well" sounds loving and affirming. But if a cancer is growing inside you and you need surgery, it is not loving for your doctor to tell you, "You're fine." It's deadly. We should not be surprised when people are unhappy with us. To receive the good news that you have a Savior, you must first understand that you need saving. Jesus said, "If the world hates you, you know that it has hated me before it hated you. If you were of the world would love its own. But because you are not of the world, but I chose you out of the world, because of this, the world hates you." A slave is not greater than his master. If they persecuted me, they will also persecute you. The need to be popular in a world system that hates the real Jesus encourages us to remake Him and ourselves in the image of that world system. When we modify God's Word, whether to increase our own popularity or to try to make the church and the Bible more acceptable to a fallen world, we begin the journey toward apostasy. We have warning signs right before our eyes. We call them liberal denominations, but they were not always like that. They didn't go from zealous for God to cold and indifferent in a day. They worried that the gospel was becoming irrelevant to a new era, and they started changing things. At last, they changed so much that while their forebears would recognize parts of their liturgy, they would be appalled at their actual beliefs and teachings. Today, these churches place their hope for a new growth in the same old mistakes. This time, ordaining homosexuals, advocating abortion, and abandoning the Jewish people. They preach to empty pews, their doctrine as dark as their vast hollow sanctuaries. Yet even with that warning before our eyes, many evangelical churches are now falling for the same lie, that to expand their appeal, they must alter the message. Evangelicalism has become pragmatic in nature, judging success by the size of the crowds and buildings and offerings. But God's measure of success remains basic. Were you faithful? Even the best pastors find it increasingly difficult to talk about things that may make their congregation uncomfortable. Today, everyone has a family member or a friend, a co-worker or neighbor, who is homosexual. It is loving to call that behavior sin, but it isn't easy. It's easier to remain silent. But remember this, silence implies approval. And approval can be a pleasant way of expressing that most severe curse, go to hell. in Revelation chapter 12, we see Satan, the accuser of the brethren, cast down from heaven. Verse 11 says, "And they overcame him," that is, the devil, "by the blood of the Lamb, and by the word of their testimony, and they loved not their lives unto death." There will be a falling away, but there will also be great ingathering for those who, through Jesus, will overcome. Will the Son of Man find faith on the earth? Yes, because the church is his work. And he said the gates of hell will not prevail against it. Think on these things and pray about them, for we are at the time of the end. God bless you, and God willing, I'll see you next week.
You've been watching the Hal Lindsey Report. To support this program, send your tax-deductible gift to Hal Lindsey Media Ministries, P.O. Box 470470, Tulsa, Oklahoma 74147. You can also support this ministry online. Visit hallindsey.com or call 1-888-RAPTURE.